Lurkers explores the dark side of the online world. It contains adult themes and disturbing content for mature audiences only. Some messages and calls are recreated by human voices with sound design.
Somewhere in the United States, a bedroom light turns on. Someone whispers,
"What was that?"
At the end of the street, headlights cut through the dark. Then another set. Then another. Inside the house, no one knows why they're there. A mother steps into the hallway. A father looks through the blinds. A child wakes up confused. Outside, officers are taking positions because a call came in. A violent emergency. A threat. A house full of danger. But none of it is real. There is no hostage, no weapon, no emergency. Only a lie made by someone very far away. Someone behind a screen, someone who knew that one false call could send SWAT to a stranger's door. A pattern that would repeat itself over and over. And years later, across the world in Finland, that same pattern would cross the Atlantic. Only this time, it wouldn't come with sirens. It wouldn't come with boots. It wouldn't stop at the front door. It would arrive quietly to tens of thousands of patients, each one tied to a name, a patient file, therapy notes, and enough proof to make the threat feel real, because the message was not asking them to imagine what could happen. It was showing them what had already been taken, the most private parts of their lives. And if they didn't pay, those secrets would be posted for the entire world to see.
In a world where connection is effortless, every click feels safe. But online, trust can be deceiving. This is Lurkers, true stories of trust, desire, and how technology, if unchecked, can turn it all against us.
The internet has a way of making distance feel harmless. A person can be in one country, typing into a room full of strangers. Someone else can be across an ocean, asleep in their own bed. And between them, there is no hallway, no door, no face, no hand reaching out. Just a screen. But sometimes, that screen is enough. Enough to borrow another person's name. Enough to break into a system. Enough to make police move. Enough to turn a lie into something real. And eventually, enough to turn something private into power. And when someone learns that kind of power early, something changes. Distance starts to feel like protection. Aliases start to feel like cover. Systems begin to look less like walls, and more like things that can be pushed from far away. The online world stops being a place they visit, and it becomes a weapon. The hardest part about stories like this one is that they don't begin where the worst damage happens. They begin smaller. A name on a screen. A room full of strangers. Someone learning that the internet can make them feel bigger than they are. And by the time the world understands what that means, the damage has already reached people who never saw it coming. The name at the center of this case is Aleksanteri Kivimaki. You may see him referred to in older reporting as Julius Kivimaki. Same person. For clarity, we'll call him Kivimaki. But before his case became tied to one of the most disturbing data breach cases in Europe, He was moving through cybercrime circles under handles instead of his real name. And with handles, I mean aliases. Masks. According to Yle, Finland's national public broadcaster, Kivimäki's record reached back to those early years online. Before most people ever heard the name Lizard Squad, before PlayStation and Xbox outages became headlines, before a therapy database in Finland became a crime scene, there was another name around him. Hack the Planet, a hacker group. And in 2013, that world led investigators to Las Vegas. DEF CON, one of the biggest hacker conferences in the world. Las Vegas is already a city built on illusion. Lights, noise, screens, people pretending to be lucky, rich, untouchable. And somewhere inside that city, investigators believed a handle might finally become a person. The handle? Zekiel. According to the documentary series Most Wanted Teen Hacker, the FBI used another hacker to help bring him in. Someone with a handle Starfall, and arranged a meeting at the Bellagio. Kivimäki thought he was walking into a room with someone from the scene. But Starfall had a wire. It was bait. Agents were nearby, and when they came in, the mystery started to collapse. Zekiel was not an untouchable ghost behind a screen. He was a teenager, 15 years old, from Finland. For the FBI, that changed the room. This wasn't an adult suspect from across town. This was a minor from another country. So, his parents were contacted. They came to Las Vegas from Finland. Devices were searched. And then Kivimäki left with them. Back home. Back across the ocean. Yes, you're correct. The Las Vegas meeting did not end the story. It became part of something much larger. Years later, when Finnish reporting and cybersecurity coverage looked back at the early cybercrime case, the scale was hard to ignore. More than 50,000 computer-related offenses. More than 50,000. Not one account. Not one stolen password. A pattern. But the next stage was different, because what came next would move beyond stolen access and frozen screens. It would move into homes, into emergency calls, into police radios, into families waking up to officers outside their doors. The internet had already made him visible. Now it was about to make other people afraid.
Roger, on your screen, 318 East 3rd Street.
In 2014, the fear you heard from the beginning of this episode became part of the record around Kivimäki. According to Yle, he called an emergency center in the United States and misled authorities into sending police special forces to the home of an FBI agent's parents. That agent was Ryan Brogan, a Newark-based FBI cybercrime agent who had been investigating Hack the Planet, and the person behind Zekiel. So that target was not random. It was close to the investigation. But Brogan's family was not the only family pulled into this kind of fear. Reporting and victim accounts describe other people connected to Kivimäki's online world being targeted through harassment, threats, and false emergency calls.
911 with Air
This is called swatting, a fake emergency call designed to make people respond as if people inside a home are in immediate danger. The person making the call doesn't need to break in. They don't need to be near the address. They only need the call to sound real enough for the system to react. That is what makes swatting so dangerous. The system has to react before anyone can prove the call is false. By the time the truth catches up, the family has already lived through the fear. For investigators, this was no longer just about a username. They had already met the teenager behind Z-Kill in Las Vegas. They knew there was a real person behind the handle. At the end of the day, knowing who he was didn't stop what came next. By then, another name was entering the public record around him. Lizard Squad. This was a hacking group known for loud public disruptions, threats, takedowns, and attacks designed to get attention. Kivimaki was publicly associated with the group, and the name would soon appear around incidents that moved far beyond private hacker forums. It went high into US airspace. On August 24, 2014, an American Airlines flight carrying John Smedley, the president of Sony Online Entertainment, was diverted after a bomb threat publicly connected to Lizard Squad. The plane was sent to Phoenix. Passengers waited. Luggage was searched. A normal flight became a security event because of a threat made from outside the aircraft. Again, the damage was not only online. A message created a real-world response. People who had nothing to do with the person behind it were forced into the middle of it. Then came the version millions of people actually noticed. Christmas Day 2014, when PlayStation Network and Xbox Live went down. For many families, it started with something ordinary. A new console, a new game, a child trying to log in. But the services would not load. Parents checked the Wi-Fi, restarted routers, refreshed screens, and tried again. The problem was not in the living room. The networks were being knocked offline. The Guardian reported that Lizard Squad claimed responsibility for the Christmas attacks. To people at home, it looked like internet chaos. Frustrating, annoying, maybe even childish. But underneath the public disruption was a colder pattern. Attention through damage. Families swatted at home. A plane diverted in the air. Gaming networks knocked offline on Christmas morning. Different places, different victims, different levels of harm. But each incident showed the same pattern. A person behind a screen could force real systems and real people to respond. In 2015, the earlier cybercrime case finally caught up with Kivimaki in Finland. By then, the scale had already been described in staggering terms. More than 50,000 computer-related offenses. But the consequence was limited. Krebs on Security reported that, as a juvenile, Kivimaki received suspended sentences. Suspended. Not years behind bars. And the story didn't end there. The next version would be quieter. It would sit inside a database in Finland, inside a company people trusted in moments they believed were confidential. And when that system failed, the damage would not look like a frozen screen, a police response, or a public outage. It would look like exposure. Because the next door Kivimaki would be accused of crossing was not physical, it was private. So before we go to Vastaamo, hold on to this imbalance. The online world can give power to someone we don't see, someone we don't know, and still leave real people dealing with the consequences. That is why, if you know someone who still thinks online harm stays online, share this episode with them. And if Lurkers helps you see these patterns more clearly, follow the show and leave a quick review. It helps us grow the show, yes, but it also helps people understand who they might be dealing with behind the screen. Vastaamo was a psychotherapy provider in Finland, not a gaming network, not a social media platform, Not a place where people went to perform a version of themselves for the internet. No, people went there for therapy. They went there because they were carrying things they couldn't safely unpack anywhere else. Depression, anxiety, family pain, trauma, addiction, grief, things people might not tell their friends, things they might not tell their parents, things they might barely know how to explain to themselves. And in a therapy room, privacy is not a luxury. It is the condition that makes the room work. You sit down because you believe it's a safe space. You speak because you believe the conversation stays there. But in Vastamo's case, the room had another version of itself, a digital one, a database. Behind the appointments, behind the therapist's notes, behind the patient records, there was infrastructure, logins, medical data, systems meant to hold the details of people's most private lives. And according to Finnish authorities, that system was not protected the way it needed to be. The Finnish prosecution service later dated the aggravated computer break-in to November 25 and 26 of 2018. And separately, Finland's data protection ombudsman found that the patient database had been accessed by an outside attacker at least twice, first in December 2018 and then again in March 2019. My friends, this wasn't something that appeared suddenly in 2020. The exposure began earlier, long before patients received threats, long before the public understood what had happened, long before Vastaamo became a national crisis. And yes, the regulator later described serious problems in how the data had been protected. An unprotected MySQL port, a root database account without password protection, a database server open to the internet without firewall protection for a long stretch of time, from at least November 26, 2017 until March 13, 2019. In plain language, the system holding therapy records had weaknesses that shouldn't have been there. And the damage was not just technical, because when a database like that is exposed, the thing at risk is not only a password. It isn't only a billing address. It is the record of someone trying to survive something. The Data Protection Ombudsman later found that Vastaamo likely knew by March 2019 that patient data had disappeared, and that it may have reached an outside attacker. But the public crisis did not arrive then. For patients, life kept moving. Appointments continued. People went to work, picked up children, took medication, sat in waiting rooms, spoke to therapists, trusted that what they were saying was still protected. And then, in 2020, the private failure became public. It was here that Vastaamo was contacted by someone using the alias Ransom Man. The demand was not subtle. According to the court record, the company was asked for 40 Bitcoin, around 366,000 euros at the time. The message was clear: pay, or patient records would be released. This is where the story changed shape. Until this point, the breach was something that could have stayed behind corporate walls. Lawyers, executives, security consultants, police reports, a company trying to understand what had been taken and when. But the attacker had something more powerful than access. He had proof, and proof in an extortion case becomes pressure. On October 21st, 2020, after Vastaamo did not pay, 100 patient records were published. 100 people. Names, sensitive information, therapy material that was never meant to leave the room. Then, on October 22nd, another 100 records were published. Another warning. Another group of patients pulled into a crime they had never agreed to be part of. This was no longer just a company being extorted. It was a demonstration, a way of showing Vastaamo, the police, the press, and the patients themselves that the threat was real. That is what made this case different from so many data breaches. Usually, when people hear the word hack, they picture stolen credit cards, reset passwords, a company apology, maybe a year of identity monitoring. Because you can cancel a card, you can change a password, you can create a social media account, but you can't take back what you said in therapy once it becomes leverage. And for the people whose records were exposed, the fear was not abstract. It was specific. What exactly did they have? Who would see it? Family? Employers? Strangers? Could one therapy note become something someone else could hold over them? The damage was not only that information was stolen, it was the fear of where it could go next. By late October 2020, the breach was no longer contained inside Vastaamo. Police were investigating. The company was under pressure. Patients were beginning to understand that something they trusted had failed at the deepest level. But the person behind the demand didn't stop with the company. Because if Vastaamo wouldn't pay, there was another pressure point. The patients themselves. And that is where this crime became even more personal. Not a database, not a company. A message in someone's inbox. A demand addressed directly to the person whose pain had been stolen. For patients, this was the moment the breach became personal in a new way. It was no longer only about what had been taken. It was about what someone was now threatening to do with it. According to the Associated Press, prosecutors said the attacker demanded money from patients after demanding payment from Vastaamo. The amounts were smaller than the company Ransom, but the pressure was much more personal. 200 euros, 500 euros. For some people, maybe that number looked low enough to consider. Low enough to wonder if paying would make the nightmare stop. Low enough to make somebody sit alone with their phone and ask a terrible question. What is my privacy worth right now? That is what made the patient extortion so cruel. If you've listened to Lurkers before, you know the pattern. A photo, a confession, a location, a piece of trust turned against someone. But here, the attacker didn't have to coax anything out of them. He already had the material. And the demand was not only about money, it was about fear. The AP later reported that about 20 patients paid. 20 people. Not because paying guaranteed safety, not because the attacker could be trusted, but because in that moment, the threat was built to make people feel trapped. And then, on October 23, 2020, the situation escalated again. Court records say an automated command sequence was started to continue publishing patient records. But instead of the records continuing in small batches, the command caused the data to be published all at once. Approximately 33,000 people's highly sensitive personal and patient data, names, personal information, visit notes, the kind of material people live with long after the headline fades. Friends, this is what makes this horrific. Once private data is released, the victim can't simply go back to the way before. Oh wait, let me become anonymous again. No. Once it's out, it's out. And a company can issue a statement, a regulator can open an investigation, police can collect reports, courts can eventually sentence someone. But for the person exposed, the fear stays. Something private may still exist somewhere out there, beyond their reach, beyond their control. Across Finland, people were trying to understand what to do next. Someone contacted police. Someone looked for legal guidance. Someone preserved messages. Someone worried about identity theft, or about family, employers, neighbors, or strangers finding details they had never chosen to share. And if you think about it, reporting the crime came with its own burden. It meant engaging with a breach again, documenting harm, filing reports, and becoming one of thousands of people inside a case that kept growing. The National Bureau of Investigation later said the case involved more than 23,000 victim offense report records. Investigators examined 1 petabyte of data. My friends, that is roughly 1,000 terabytes. That is the storage equivalent of hundreds of millions of phone photos. And the investigation file ran about 2,200 pages. That was the scale. Then there were also the formal charges. 21,316 counts of attempted aggravated extortion, 20 counts of aggravated extortion, and 9,598 counts of aggravated dissemination of information, violating personal privacy. In plain terms, to make it easy and keep track, 21,000 attempts, 20 completed extortions, thousands of privacy violations. Oh yes, rest assured Finland felt it, not as a distant cyber incident, but as a national violation. Medical privacy turned into leverage. And for a while, the question was not only what had happened, it was who had done it, because a person calling himself Ransom Man had shown he could reach inside a therapy company, pressure the patients, and publish what he claimed to control. But investigators were not starting from nothing. Kivimäki was already known from his earlier cybercrime cases, and that world had left traces. Ransom Man was not just a name on a screen. Whoever was behind it had used accounts, servers, timing, messages, payment pressure, and public leaks. And in a case this large, every digital action had the potential to leave something behind. By 2022, Finnish authorities were no longer only investigating the breach itself, they were building a case against the person they believed was behind it. That October, authorities believed they had enough to move forward against Kivimäki. Helsinki District Court made decisions to arrest him, but he was not yet in custody, so the case moved beyond Finland. In February 2023, Kivimäki was arrested in France. According to the court record, the Versailles Court of Appeal approved his surrender in Finland under a European arrest warrant on February 15, 2023. 6 months later, on August 31, 2023, Finland's National Bureau of Investigation announced that the criminal investigation was complete and had been sent to prosecutors. Then, On October 18, 2023, the Finnish Prosecution Service brought charges. At that point, the numbers were already overwhelming. Tens of thousands of victims, thousands of privacy violations, thousands of reports. But the courtroom had to reduce all of that into evidence, charges, arguments, and a verdict. On April 30th, 2024, the Western Uusimaa District Court found Kivimäki guilty on all Vastaamo-related charges. He was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. For victims, the sentence gave the case an official answer, a name, a conviction, a prison term, but it didn't make at all the story simple. Kivimäki denied the charges, and the case continued into appeal. In February 2026, the Helsinki Court of Appeal increased the sentence to 6 years and 11 months. That was 1 month short of the maximum 7 years allowed by law. And still, after all of that, even that wasn't the final line. In April 2026, Yle reported that Kivimäki had asked Finland's Supreme Court to hear the case. So even after the appeal sentence, there was still another possible step. For victims, justice and relief were not the same thing. After the court dates, there were still practical questions. Could victims be compensated? And for what? And how do you prove damage when the damage is private? And sure, the state treasury later gave victims guidance on compensation, including distress, temporary harm, lost earnings, legal costs, and medical or therapy expenses, but some wounds don't fit neatly into a form. How do you measure the cost of wondering whether a private sentence from your therapy record still exists somewhere online? How do you measure the fear of being honest in therapy again? Or with anyone? And here is what makes it even more cruel. Vastaamo itself didn't survive the crisis. The company was declared bankrupt in 2021. And Finland's data protection ombudsman later imposed a €608,000 fine and a reprimand over data protection violations. The failure was bigger than one person behind a screen. It was also about a system people trusted at their most vulnerable, and what happens when that system fails behind the scenes. A patient can do everything right. Book the appointment, sit in the room, trust the professional, trust the company, trust the promise that medical privacy means something, right? And still, someone far away can reach them, not because the patient made a mistake, but because the wrong person found the wrong opening and knew exactly how to use it. At the beginning of this episode, fear arrived loudly. Headlights, police radios, a knock at the door. But Vastaamo showed the quieter version. No sirens, no officers outside. Just access, a database, a message, a threat, and the realization that a stranger could know something deeply private about you. That is why this case stays with so many people, and honestly, it stayed with me too. It made me angry, but more than that, it made me think about trust. How much of it we have to give just to live our lives, to get help, and to be honest, even to heal. And that is not the victim's mistake. Trust is supposed to be part of therapy. It is supposed to be part of care. But when private information falls into the wrong hands, it becomes power. And the online world can give that power a reach it was never supposed to have. That is what this story leaves behind. Not just fear of hackers. No, not just fear of databases, but the understanding that privacy is only as strong as the systems holding it. And when those systems fail, man, the damage doesn't stay on a server. It follows people back into their homes, their relationships, their work, their therapy rooms, and the quiet places where they're still trying to feel safe. Because sometimes, my friends, the most dangerous exposure is not what a stranger knows. It is what that knowledge gives them the power to do. And with this, I leave you. If this episode stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to understand what a breach can do. And if Lurkers helps you see the patterns more clearly, follow the show and leave a quick review. My dear listener, it helps more people find these stories. Stay aware, stay present, stay safe. This episode of Lurkers was researched and narrated by me, Frank Battiston. Production and sound design by Daniel Erdenivia. Thanks for listening.